Now the question is why? Why should the IQ be so low? This is Soweto, which is a township, or in fact now it's a suburb of Johannesburg. And as you can see, there's abject poverty. These are little tin shacks with no running water, no electricity, and there's no street lighting. It's terrible crimes out there at nighttime. And you can imagine if you had a child of your own going to school, coming home, and sitting in a place like this with many extended family members, he's not going to go off to a little study and fire up his home computer or go down to the local library and so on. I mean, conditions really are very bad. And so perhaps these are the sorts of factors that do contribute some source of variance to IQ scores. But on the other hand, there is now a wealth of literature to show that brain size is highly heritable, IQ scores are highly heritable, and that there are significant and substantial differences between the races in brain size. And this has been known for 150 years. It may have disappeared off the scientific radar screen, but Charles Darwin actually referred to black-white differences in brain size as a scientific set of facts, which were well known at that time, in order to support his then controversial theory of the human evolution. Well, today the whole thing is reversed. Now evolution is much less controversial among scientists, but race differences in brain size, nobody knows anything about, even though many, many studies continue to appear showing the black-white differences. The magnitude of the differences, whites have on average about 6% more neurons and cranial capacity, cranial size than do blacks, and East Asians may have up to a 2% advantage over whites. We know that there's a positive correlation between brain size and IQ because especially now the state-of-the-art magnetic resonance imaging studies which are coming out once a month, once every 2 months, where you can actually take a picture of the person's brain just before you give them an IQ test or just after you've given them an IQ test, and there are lots of studies done, and the average correlation is about 0.4 between brain size measured this way and IQ scores. As I said, the race differences in brain size are absolutely hard facts. This particular study shows from birth onwards. This was a huge national collaborative perinatal project that was carried out by the National Institutes of Health. They broke everything down by race. They didn't always publish the results this way, but you could go into the archives and dig it out and recover it in the way that I've put onto this screen. And it shows essentially that Asians, whites, and blacks at birth are actually born with the racially predictable brain size differences. At 4 months, 1 year, 4 years, and 7 years, as well as in adulthood, these brain size differences remain. Furthermore, in this particular study, at age 4 and at age 7, all the children were given IQ tests, and there were about 50,000. It was a huge, huge study. In every one of the racial groups, those Asians with larger heads were more intelligent than those Asians with smaller heads. Those blacks with larger heads were more intelligent than those blacks with smaller heads. Now, the correlation is quite small as far as external head size. It's about 0.2. So you wouldn't want to look at somebody's head and try and predict their IQ scores. You'd be much better off giving them an IQ test. But it just is that there is a relationship. And when you look at big groups, such as blacks and whites, then brain size is a very big predictor of the group average differences. This is some cute baby pictures, rather politically correct babies. But it does show that babies come in all kinds of shapes, sizes, and colors. These, you can easily measure head size in a baby. In fact, one of the standard measurements at birth is to put a tape measure around the head and then make sure that it's not abnormal in some way, too large a head or too small a head. And those head sizes are predictive. The thing, though, that you can tell from this picture is just what a proportion of a human being is the size of the brain. As we get older and as adults, our heads are a much smaller fraction of our overall body than it is when we're babies. And these babies have very large heads for their body size. Now, in evolutionary terms, this has required a tremendous amount of reorganization of the human body. This is, for example, the birth canal. Large-brained babies pose a serious problem, a life threat, to mothers who give birth to them. Consequently, you would expect that white women have a larger pelvis and a larger birth canal than do black women, and they do. The differences are there on the screen. I haven't actually got on the screen, I don't have the data in front of me, but I understand that the prediction does come out that East Asian women have an even larger birth canal than white women. And this is as an accommodation over evolutionary terms in order to give birth to large-brained babies. This is me with a couple of my skeletal friends. I'm a psychologist, and the stock in trade that I ply my living with is paper and pencil tests, such as the IQ test that I was telling you about earlier that I took to South Africa. But my fiancée, Elizabeth, who is working the slides for me, and actually made up all the slides for me, is a physical anthropologist. And so we have teamed up to do some analyses on progress and evolution. And it's been an eye-opener for me just how incredibly interesting race differences are in the skeleton. These are lower jaws. And if you look at the base of the jaw, you will see, perhaps counterintuitively, that this area here is less wide than this area here. In other words, blacks have a less wide back jaw than do white people, even though most people would think, well, blacks have big jaws because they're much longer, they're heavier, they're more prognathic, they stick out in front of the face, and so on. But at the back of the jaw, whites are actually wider than are blacks. And this is the upper jaw. Asians, the one on the left here, see here is much wider than whites. Why should this be? Well, it makes perfect sense if you think of the expansion of the brain size. As the brain expands, it expands wide. Now, one of the directions it expands is wide. It becomes more globular, more circular. And as it does so, it has cascading effects all through the skeleton, all through the skull. One of the things it does is it takes those jaw bones with it. The jaws have to widen so that they can attach to the base of the head, which is now wider to accommodate the much bigger brain. So these brain size differences between the races even show up at the back of the jaws. There are all kinds of muscle attachment sites in the head. The part circled in red, I don't know whether you can see it very well, are some little protuberances to which muscles attach. And you can see on the right-hand side there that this is more spiked in blacks than in whites, and Asians it's even more curved. The more spiked it is and the more spikes there are, the more muscles can attach. What this tells you is that there's a lot more muscle attachments in the black skull than there is in the white skull, and more muscle attachments in the white skull than there is in the East Asian skull. Again, why? Well, because as the brain expands, it does so at the expense of what else is in the skull. Now, this is a skull right behind the, if you look at the yellow arrowhead here, this is a big indentation. In fact, you can almost feel it in yourself. Right behind the eye, there is a indentation in the skull. It's called the post-orbital constriction. And this post-orbital constriction is larger in Australopithecus and chimpanzees than it is in Homo erectus. It's larger in blacks than it is in whites, larger in whites than it is in East Asians. The red line that goes down, there's actually a hole there behind that little bone, if you can see it, is where muscles attach. Huge muscles that go from the top of the head down through the cheekbone underneath the jaw. You've probably all seen the poor embarrassed person who falls asleep on the subway train and his jaw drops open and he has no idea that he's holding it, because consciously you have to hold the jaw closed. And when you relax those temporalis muscles, the jaw drops open. Well, the muscles are much bigger in blacks than they are in whites, bigger in whites than they are in Asians, because they have to hold up a big jaw. The reason why Asians have smaller jaws than, say, blacks is because, again, as the brain expanded, it had to do so at somebody or something's expense. And what it did was it filled in that hole and filled in the postorbital constriction and took away the muscles. Consequently, the muscular gets less, the jaw has to get less. And if you go through all the jaw features, things like the size of the jaw, the number of teeth in the jaw, the depths of the roots in the jaw, and so on, blacks have more teeth, larger roots, and a bigger jaw. And Asians have fewer teeth, with smaller teeth, with fewer, shorter roots. Now, this is Taboo is a new book that just came out by John Entine. Why do blacks do so well at sports and why are we afraid to talk about it? Is now going to be explained by me in terms of brain size expansion. These are the variables that blacks have advantages of in sports if you read Entine's book. Things like 3 to 19% more testosterone. Broader shoulders, narrower hips, that's significant. More muscle, less fat, greater bone density, higher center of gravity, faster knee-jerk reaction, higher percentage of fast twitch muscles, longer arms, and distal elongation of segments, which basically means that blacks have longer hands relative to forearms, relative to upper arms, compared to whites who have longer distal elements than do East Asians. But let me draw your attention to, I believe, the hips. Is it? Can I? No, what's the next one? Was that the next one? Okay, the thigh bone. Blacks have narrow hips. It gives them an advantage at running because the thigh bone, which comes out of the hip, can go directly, vertically straight down to the knee. The knee has to be directly underneath the body in order to give it support. And so you have a very efficient, straightforward stride. Whereas, as the hips expand sideways, say in East Asians, the thigh bone comes out of those hips at an angle and has to curve back down into the knees, which again still have to be directly under the body to support it. And then you get large platforms at the knee joint. And in fact, if you find a skeleton in your backyard and you call in the police will call in a physical anthropologist, a forensic anthropologist, and it's really quite amazing what they can tell, even just from a thigh bone. Not only will they tell you how old the skeleton is or whether it's a male or a female, but they'll also tell you what race it is. So for those who say race is only skin deep and so on, a forensic anthropologist say, well, you know, you may not be able to tell from the skin, but you can certainly tell from the bones. White bones, East Asian bones, have much more of a curve on them than do black bones. It's one of the reasons why whites and East Asians even less are good at running and jumping and playing basketball and so on. Blacks have an advantage at sports because they have narrow hips and straight, energetically efficient thigh bones. But they have energetically efficient thigh bones and hips because they have smaller brains. The large brain had these cascading effects throughout the body that made locomotion just a little bit less efficient. Now, this is an interesting bell curve because it looks like a bell curve for IQ scores. In fact, it's the bell curve for knee joints. Some angle at which the thigh bone meets the knee pretty well mirrors the IQ differences between blacks and whites. Now, I would hazard a prediction, but I could easily be proven wrong, that you could actually measure people's angle at the knee and predict what kind of IQ score or brain size they would have. This is brain size of progress in evolution over evolutionary time. It shows the expansion, the encephalization of the brain, the hominid brain, over the last 4 million years. 4 million years ago, Australopithecus, our ancestors, distant ancestors, something like a chimpanzee, had a brain size of about 400 cubic centimeters. 2 million years ago, Homo erectus had expanded to about 1,000 cubic centimeters. And about 200,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens, such as ourselves, had 1,200, 1,250 cubic centimeters. And then, as we've seen earlier in this talk, we go blacks, whites, and East Asians in increasing brain size differences. The same kind of chart over evolutionary time could have been mapped for almost any of those skeletal or muscular traits that I identified before. And this is something that we'll be working on over the next 2 or 3 months. Well, brain size is important not just because of its effects on the skeleton, but because, of course, it's the mediator of behavior. And the social behavior you see in group averages is exactly what you would expect from the group averages in brain size.